Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is my co-host, attorney and Republican strategist Jay Carson. We start today with the resignation of Secretary of Health and Human Services Tom Price in the wake of a travel scandal involving Price spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in government funds to charter flights as opposed to taking far less expensive commercial flights as his predecessors at HHS did. Now this, along with what President Trump viewed as Price's ineffectiveness in the effort to repeal and replace Obamacare, led to the resignation. And now we're at a point where just over 8 months into the administration, we've seen the departure of a national security advisor, a press secretary, 2 communications directors, a chief strategist, an acting attorney general, an FBI director, and now an HHS secretary. So, Jay, what do you make of this latest development?
What I've done is I've queued up. I think we should have this audio just always handy.
You're fired.
Just kind of have that just so we that every like as an intro to look. I think this is a Trump doing the right thing. I think it's hard for anybody to argue that this is a wrong thing to do. I mean, I guess if you're a real partisan, you can make the argument, oh well, other administrations have done this too. And I mean, my first thought when I heard this was going back to John Sununu, who did something similar, who liked to kind of traipse around on Air Force One. But look, I mean, what else can you do to the guy? And I think I think it was the right action.
No, I actually agree. And I know a lot of people will say, certainly people on the left will say, this is just another example of the dysfunctional Trump administration thing. But I feel like this is different. And I agree that the president did the right thing in getting rid of Tom Price. And so I don't lump this in with a lot of these other things where, Donald Trump was acting hastily, injudiciously and that sort of thing. So to me, this was a smart move. Tom Price made a huge mistake, and he's paid for it. And so,
yeah, if the Trump administration is to be faulted for anything on this, it would be not paying closer attention, and not having a sense that knowing that Price was doing this. Now, I think you can. I think you could also make a pretty decent argument. Look, the White House shouldn't be micromanaging the airline reservations of its cabinet members. But regardless, I think since he found out about it, and you'll notice also it was originally there was like 1 flight or 2 flights, and Price said he'd reimburse, and then it came out it was really much more than that. So I think this was the right thing, and it's the right sort of swamp draining sort of move also. But I think something that this is just the problem is it's so endemic in Washington is this sort of sense of entitlement that once someone gets into office and into power, and Tom Price, who had been sort of a budget hawk back in his congressional days, all of a sudden, is very much into the trappings of executive power, and that's I think that's a problem that you always see. I mean, it comes in different manifestations.
Yeah. No, I think that's entirely bipartisan. You're absolutely right that once one's exposed to those little perks and benefits, or sometimes not so little perks and benefits, it's so easy to make the rationalizations and justifications. And we've seen that from Republicans, we've seen that from Democrats, and of course, as you, I'm sure, point out is that's what some people say is that's why we need less government, because no matter the problem isn't Democrats or Republicans, the problem is governmental power corrupts, and it's one thing when it's done on some corporation's dime, it's another thing when it's done on the public dime, basically.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
And the idea that he could be such a lax watchdog of his own spending, I think, is a problem. Now, the other piece you mentioned is this also due to the failure of repeal and replace? And my sense is probably a little bit more along the lines of, look, if if Tom Price had been a superstar and had passed, repeal and replace, I think the sense might have been, all right, we'll cut him some slack and Tom, just don't do it again, sort of thing, as opposed to this, where he was, not a star player. And I don't know that you can blame the failure of repeal and replace on him. But sometimes life isn't fair, and he was sort of the guy at the head, so he's got to bear some responsibility for it.
Yeah, I think Tom Price will be just fine. Now, before we get to our next story, we want to thank our first sponsor for today, and that is DaVinci. In this age of Skype and Slack and FaceTime and all that, face-to-face meetings still matter. I mean, I think until we have, Star Trek-like hollow projection meeting technology, the face-to-face meeting, it's still the best way to get to know people, iron out issues, sign deals, all that sort of stuff. But do you really want to meet an important client or a potential investor in a coffee shop? I mean, it doesn't exactly scream professionalism. The good news, now you can skip the noisy coffee shops and expensive hotel conference rooms you might have been considering as a more professional alternative, and simply book a DaVinci meeting room. DaVinci provides you instant access to over 5,000 incredibly affordable meeting rooms in well-known locations in every city, and they make it totally easy. You just search, book, and meet, and your DaVinci meeting room comes fully staffed and equipped with all the latest tech, plus high-speed internet. Whether you need a day office, a conference room, a boardroom, or a training space, DaVinci has what you need to make your next business meeting a success. And best of all, DaVinci meeting rooms start at just $10 an hour. So whether you're an entrepreneur, startup, Fortune 500 company, hey, they all can enhance their image with professional meeting spaces from DaVinci. Basically, it's like an Airbnb for meeting rooms. Great idea. And if you book your space now at DaVinciMeeting.com/TPG, the first hour is on them. That's DaVinciMeeting.com/TPG, and your first hour is free. Terms and conditions apply. For details, see DaVinciMeeting.com/TPG. Where are you holding your next meeting? All right, moving on, Jay. Next, we're going to talk about Puerto Rico, which was, of course, devastated by Hurricane Maria, and there's this massive relief effort underway now, but there are a lot of factors that are making it difficult, like, it's been difficult getting supplies to ports, backups at ports that are caused by limited availability of fuel, limited availability of trucks and drivers, major damage to infrastructure. I mean, so we're seeing problems that we haven't seen in Houston and Florida in the wake of Hurricanes Harvey and Irma. And another problem unique to Puerto Rico is the existence of the Jones Act, that 1920 law requiring that goods shipped between U.S. ports be carried on ships that are built, owned, and operated by Americans. Now, President Trump...
Which to me, as a free trader, you can imagine how I feel about that.
Oh, yeah, we're going to talk about that. Absolutely. I agree with you. Now, on Thursday, President Trump issued a 10-day waiver of the Jones Act for Puerto Rico, which then that waiver can be extended if necessary. The president has said all along that these relief efforts have been incredible, whereas some critics, including the mayor of San Juan, claim that the government response has been too slow and too small. So what do you think, Jay?
I think this is one of these situations where this is why you call it a disaster. I mean, this is a terrible things that have happened. And as you mentioned, Puerto Rico is different in terms of our ability to respond, partially because it's an island. It's more difficult to get help in there. From what I understand, there's 10,000 FEMA personnel in there right now. But the problem is more inside Puerto Rico, and just the infrastructure doesn't exist now. I mean, existed maybe a couple weeks ago in order to get these supplies out there. Likewise, things like in situations like Houston and in Florida, you had an electrical grid system that was damaged and could be repaired. My understanding in a lot of Puerto Rico, that system has just been destroyed. It's got to be rebuilt. Same goes for roads, and the biggest issue to my understanding is truck drivers. You just don't have the personnel there, and getting personnel in there to drive trucks to deliver the cargo that's actually already been delivered to the island has been one of the biggest holdups. the governor of Puerto Rico has been more generous towards the administration and said they believes that they're doing everything they can. And look, I understand the mayor of San Juan obviously has to speak up for his people and say he needs help and all that, and probably doesn't mind taking a shot at Trump too along the way. But to me, this sort of speaks to kind of the limits of what government can do, and actually to the limits of what mankind can do. When faced with this kind of disaster, it's just a hard slog to get through.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. And, one other thing that we haven't pointed out, I think that's also important is, of course, in the wake of Harvey and Irma, I mean, FEMA and emergency responders are already stretched pretty thin. We're not used to seeing all of this happen all at once. And so, I mean, my sense of things is that the Trump administration is doing, a decent job. I don't know if I'd call it incredible, but it's certainly, they're doing I think a solid job. It's in a difficult situation. The only thing I would fault the administration for is I don't think that President Trump needed to get involved in a personal Twitter war with the mayor of San Juan. But aside from that, I think this has been about as good a response. Maybe one other thing you could say is Trump should have been a little quicker to grant that Jones Act waiver. But honestly, even there's some dispute as to whether or not that really was an issue, because according to a number of people, the problem wasn't so much that there wasn't enough equipment and material at ports. The problem was getting it from the ports to actually the people who needed it. So there were some who said
and there was also a lag time between whether the Jones Act waiver is in place or not, between when any ships can get to Puerto Rico from whatever port they're in. So I mean, I think it's good that we waive the Jones Act. It'd be better if we abolished it.
I was going to ask you about that. So you would be in favor of abolishing that?
Yeah, repeal. And also the Jones Act does like about 100 other things too, besides that. But no, I think this just points out the limits of what can be done, and every disaster is a little different. Again, Houston was different than Florida, and Puerto Rico is different still. Both were different than what happened to Katrina, and it's always a learning curve, and it's adapting to situations as they happen. So, what they could have done better, and this is what frustrates me a little bit, and just in communication, the optics of it. And I know it's probably sounds kind of sleazy to talk about that, and when people are suffering, but what's something that the acting Homeland Security Secretary said? Well, this is a good news story about the appointment of the 3-star general and moving land. Just, I mean, if I could conduct a class for Trump personnel as far as the what not to say, it's sort of, you want to avoid making those kind of, this is a good news story, just because it's the big fat pitch right over the plate that if someone wants to hit it, they can knock it out of the park, and that's what the mayor of San Juan did. It's very close to the heck of a job brownie type statements that George Bush made. And that to me is a continual frustration just from the pure politics of this, because look, it's impossible to take politics out of it altogether. But they could have played that better.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think some people are trying to make Katrina, George W. Bush comparison, and I just don't think it's there. I think one thing certainly that the U.S. government learned a lot from Katrina, and a lot of things changed, and so in a sense, I agree that this is in a way, I won't call it a good news story, but it's an example of government mounting an effective response, certainly an inadequate response, but that's not because of the nature of, government inefficiency. It's more the nature of the magnitude of the disaster that they're facing, basically. So I would give the Trump administration on this, I would say a solid, B-, B, something like that. So.
No, I think that's, I'm in the same camp there.
All right. Well, before we get to our next story, we want to thank our second sponsor for today, and that is ZipRecruiter. Jay, do you know how long Donald Trump has been president at this point?
Well, it feels like years, but actually it's only been probably about 9 months or so.
Okay, yeah, let me tell you, it's been 252 days, 22 hours, 1 minute, and 35 seconds, according to How Long Has Donald Trump Been President.com. I kid you not, that is a real website, an ongoing thing. But after all that time, over 8 months, if you do the math, he still hasn't even named the nominee for 297 out of 601 key positions requiring Senate confirmation. So that's
When he's going to need a new Health and Human Services director,
there you go.
And still needs a Homeland Security advisor.
Yeah, that's right, because we only have an acting person for that. But that's a no nomination rate of nearly 50%. Now, liberals and maybe even some conservatives might point to that as a sign that Donald Trump's presidency is floundering. But maybe, just maybe, it's yet another demonstration of the old adage that good help is hard to find. And that's where ZipRecruiter comes in. With ZipRecruiter, you can post your job to 100 plus job sites with just one click. Then their powerful technology efficiently matches the right people to your job better than anyone else. And that's why ZipRecruiter is different, because unlike those other job sites, ZipRecruiter doesn't depend on candidates finding you, it finds them. In fact, over 80% of employers who post a job on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate through the site within 1 day. And there's no juggling emails or calls to your office. You just screen, rate, and manage candidates all in one place with ZipRecruiter's easy-to-use dashboard. Find out today why ZipRecruiter has been used by businesses of all sizes to find the most qualified job candidates with immediate results. And right now, Politics Guys listeners can post jobs on ZipRecruiter for free. That's right, free. And hey, if any Trump administration officials are listening, that goes for you too. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/politicsguy. That's ZipRecruiter.com/politicsguy. One more time, because I want this great free deal to get stuck in your head like a hook to one of those songs you can't get out until you play it. The post jobs are free. Go to ZipRecruiter.com/politicsguy. All right, moving on, Jay. Let's talk about the vote that wasn't. This week, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, realizing that he didn't have the votes to pass Graham-Cassidy, that's the latest Republican attempt to repeal and replace Obamacare, prevented the measure from coming to a vote. Now, because Graham-Cassidy was being considered under filibuster-proof reconciliation rules that run out on September 30th, this is basically the end of the line for a Republican-only health care law. But I should point out that Lamar Alexander, the chair of the Senate's Health Committee, and his Democratic counterpart, the ranking member, Patty Murray, they're working on a bipartisan measure to stabilize Obamacare, and we'll see where that goes. So, Jay, what are your thoughts on the failure of Graham-Cassidy, as well as maybe the prospects for some sort of bipartisan legislation on healthcare in the near future?
Well, it's John McCain's world, and we just live in it. I think that's the takeaway for me. Look, as a Republican, I'm obviously troubled that this is again the three defectors. Defectors. I mean, yes, others have referred to them as a triumvirate of this is who really runs Washington. When you've got that close of a count in the Senate, it allows a few senators to exercise power outside what they would normally exercise, and I think that's a problem. And you and I went back and forth a couple times on Facebook over the week about McCain specifically. And I guess the reason McCain probably seems to be the linchpin of this whole thing is, well, you sort of always know what Rand Paul's going to do, and you sort of always know what Susan Collins is going to do. But McCain would be sort of the Justice Kennedy of the Senate, if you will. And to me, his rationale of, well, I wanted to be a bipartisan process, I want a regular order and all that, rings hollow. Just in the fact, listen, this man has been in the Senate for as long as I've had any understanding that the Senate existed, and he knows that there wasn't going to be a bipartisan agreement. And if that were the case, he could have made that clear from day one and said he wouldn't support anything that wasn't bipartisan. But he didn't, and we went through this exercise twice now. So to me, that's troubling that he seems to be putting, whether it's anti-Trump, whether it's ego, whether it's just John McCain being John McCain. putting that ahead of potential policy changes.
Well, I won't try to delve into the motivations and psyche of John McCain. He's a complex guy, and certainly I don't entirely disagree with you as to what some of his motives might be. But to me, this points out a larger failure. When Mitch McConnell became majority leader, one of the things he did, and I've talked about this before, is he made a speech. His first speech as majority leader was about the importance of the regular order. And when Obamacare was pushed through, he talked about the importance of getting some sort of bipartisan buy-in. And he swore that that's how he was going to run things as majority leader of the Senate. And pretty clearly, he's abandoned that pretty much entirely now. And to me, that represents, a pretty significant failure, an institutional failure really. And I think the reason why is the sort of the zero-sum nature of major legislation. How it's seen now in Washington is, a win for me is a loss for you, and there aren't any, it seems like, any more legislative win-win scenarios. And some people will say that's just an inevitable consequence of a highly polarized two-party system. And I think there really is something to that. I wish there were, a simple solution to that. But I'll also point out that, the last time we saw major legislation that there was at least an attempt to start off using the regular order and getting bipartisan buy-in, that was Obamacare. People don't remember that, but Obamacare started at using essentially regular processes, trying to get Republicans to buy in. Now, Republicans pretty clearly made it clear that they weren't interested in doing that. And so it ended up being what it was. But this time, the Republicans, you could say, maybe strategically it made sense that we're never going to bother with a pretense of bipartisanship. We're just going to start using reconciliation rules and so forth. And, and again, I would say that Republicans are more to blame. Now, other people might disagree, but
I mean, you mentioned the structural. I mean, to me, a lot of it is, look, the numbers are what they are, and if you're going to be a realist, you can talk all you want about, boy, it would be great if we could do this in a bipartisan manner, but you have to recognize the reality that some people just are not going to, cannot.
Yeah, but
cross party lines on something like this.
Well, it's more than just the numbers being what they are. I mean, it's more the case where the Senate is so polarized. There used to be back in the day, say, for instance, in '86 when the last major tax reform was passed, something we'll talk about in a minute. There used to be a fair number of conservative Democrats and more liberal Republicans, and that's just, I mean, we have a couple. There's help me out here, Maine. We have I'm blinking on her name. I got Susan Collins.
Susan Collins.
There you go.
Olympia Snow.
And that's pretty much it essentially. And so occasionally you'll get a wild card like a Ted,
I would say also you've got some, say, like a Jeff Flake in Arizona. Ben Sass in Nebraska, folks who are conservative, but are also willing to work and are not Trumpians and are not Rand Paul of the nothing is nothing good enough. So
yeah, you're definitely. I think there's something to be said for that too. But I think that the biggest thing to me, the difference between the Senate now and the Senate of,
Rob
say,
Portman from Ohio too.
Sort of, I guess, but the middle is essentially missing. There used to be plenty of overlap between the Democrats and the Republicans, or at least a fair amount. There was a group of 10, 15 who were kind of in that kind of mushy middle, and now it's maybe 3 or 4 or something like that now. And that to me, I don't have any good answers for that, but until that changes, we're going to continue to see the sort of things that we see. And Mitch McConnell was absolutely right in saying that when you don't have bipartisan buy-in, you essentially have bad policy. And I agree, but it's not because these are necessarily bad people. It's a structural problem. And until we start electing different sorts of people, I don't think that's going to change.
Well, I'm going to throw out a little bit different theory. And again, this has not been tested by any sorts of actual studies or facts or evidence. But to me, this is the kind of issue where, when the times when you get bipartisan solutions are when you can have other factors that override partisanship, a strong regional interest, for example. And you don't really have that in this healthcare scenario. It's sort of purely ideological, and I think it's because also it's so complex. There is little understanding of what actually, how this is actually going to play out. Even if you understood every piece of the bill, you still wouldn't necessarily have an idea of how is this going to play out in the real world. Is this good for my state, as opposed to good for me, philosophically. And I think that's different. You don't have that. For example, on greenhouse gas stuff, on environmental stuff, you get different state interests playing into that sometimes can overcome party interest. For example, Joe mentioned, and from West Virginia, or a state with a high industrial work base might do something different. But this, it's sort of a purely ideological test, and it's just sort of which side of the aisle are you? And there's not much to pull someone one way or the other. And again, that's just my 100,000 foot read on this. But
yeah, I think you're right. Sometimes it's a factor, but more and more often, or less and less often, we see that sort of thing just because the forces of polarization just pull everyone apart so much more than those sort of things can bring people together. But,
well, and then it's also I'll keep babbling about this just one more minute. Again, to me, it does come down to the numbers, and there really are certain things I think that happen just as a matter of kind of like game theory in terms of numbers. And when you've got a close number in a legislative organization, the incentive is to hang together. When it's different, when like, hey, look, the other side's going to win anyway. The game theory seems to be more of attacking your own side. This is kind of the dynamic more in the House is in the Senate. And you get other folks who realize this is going to pass anyway. What can I get out of it? Who will go along? But I think when it's this close, there's the incentive to hold the line on both sides.
I think you used to be right on that, but I don't think you're right anymore, because I look at the House where the Democrats are, in a pretty, or the Republicans have a pretty strong majority there. I don't see the Democrats kind of going along with anything to see what they can get. I see them standing pretty firm as a group against that. So I think you used to be right. That's certainly how the Republicans operated when the Democrats had a huge majorities in the House back in the 80s and the 90s. But I think that era is largely gone. So you're a little more optimistic on this than I am, I think. So, all right, before I get to our next story, I want to thank our third sponsor today, SeatGeek. By now, you know how I feel about buying tickets to live events. I put it right up there with scheduling my semi-annual HVAC maintenance. I feel like I'm getting ripped off because, not with my HVAC guy, I love my HVAC guy, but it's the pain. Anyway, that feeling that, there got to be cheaper tickets out there, but I just don't know where they're at. But I also don't want to spend a lot of time checking out multiple ticket sites. That's why I love SeatGeek. They solve both of these problems for me. SeatGeek is the smartest, easiest way to get tickets to live events. It only takes 2 taps on the SeatGeek app to buy tickets, and it's also quick and easy if you go through their website, SeatGeek.com. And the reason why SeatGeek can give you such great deals is that they compare multiple ticket sites to find you the best deals. And they even grade every available ticket based on value, so you can instantly see what the best deals are for your budget, whatever that is. And best of all, Politics Guys listeners get $20 off their first SeatGeek purchase. All you have to do is download the SeatGeek app and enter promo code PoliticsGuy today. Or you can enter promo code PoliticsGuy and when you go buy through SeatGeek.com. That's promo code PoliticsGuy for $20 off your first SeatGeek purchase. Okay, Jay, moving on, there was more today, more this week. Alabama Senate primary, Republican electoral politics, right? I mean, this week, former Judge Roy Moore soundly defeated incumbent Senator Luther Strange in the Republican Senate primary. And Moore's win comes despite President Trump's support of Strange, which included a trip to Alabama where the president voiced his support for Strange and did a bunch of other things as well, as President Trump has wanted to do. Now, Moore will face the Democratic nominee, Doug Jones, who's a former United States attorney, in the general election on December 12th. So, Jay, this is your party. What are your thoughts on the primary? Both in terms of what it means about the president's influence and what it may say about the direction of your party.
Trey and I talked about this last week, and I think I sort of missed the call because my sense was that Luther Strange was, while Roy Moore was leading, Luther Strange was ascendant, and by the end of the day would pull it out. But I was wrong, and I think what I underestimated are sort of the factors that I would usually look to, and that is one. All politics is local to some extent, and Strange had the misfortune of having been named to the Senate by a governor who was embroiled in scandal and later forced to step down. So there was the sense of, again, this guy's part of the swamp, the establishment, he's probably a crook too. He had that strike against him. He was picked by a machine, that sort of thing. The other advantage that Roy Moore had was he'd run statewide before. And I think that's one of these things that, look, as a practitioner, as someone who's been involved in these things, that's something that you can't understate, and it never shows up on the news. But just the idea of having an organization already on the ground in place is a tremendous advantage. Having the name recognition, and Roy Moore certainly didn't lack for name recognition, because he had been famous or perhaps infamous for some time. And then the last factor I would look at is how does that impact turnout? And turnout was really pretty low, as you would expect in a off-year runoff election. So, in that sort of thing, it's Moore's got the better organization, the better people, the people who are more excited about it. It's hard to say anyone was really excited about Luther Strange, and that's what he rode to victory.
Well, to me, this sort of, well, a lot of Democrats were actually rooting for Roy Moore because there's no question
of course.
he's going to be a horrible candidate, or at least a much. I think that Roy Moore is going to end up winning the election on December 12th, but Roy Moore gives Doug Jones a lot better chance than Luther Strange would have, because Roy Moore is, in my view, slightly unhinged. And now, other people may disagree. He certainly, I guess you could say he's an ardent social conservative. I think that would be a fair statement. He's made a number of incredibly controversial statements. And, I see this as part of a larger trend. You can call it the Steve Bannonization of the party. I don't know if you want to say that, but it kind of in related news, Bob Corker from Tennessee announced he's not going to seek re-election, and in part it's because he expected a primary challenge from his right. And again, we just talked about polarization in the Senate, and if anything, I would love to see this getting better, but if anything, it seems to be getting worse, and that to me does not bode well. No matter who ends up controlling the Senate in 2018, it's almost certainly going to be the Republicans, or in 2020 and beyond. That's just not a good thing.
Yeah, I think the Alabama race is probably tough to lose, even for Moore. But the difficulty he presents for Republicans in general is that it will allow Democrats to paint other Senate candidates with the Roy Moore brush. The side-by-side ads and so forth, and Moore just calling out of listen, if you vote for whomever, Senator X, who may be a well-meaning moderate, he's really the party of Roy Moore. So that's another reason why Democrats were probably fairly happy at this.
Definitely. I mean, it gives reporters an opportunity to say, so Roy Moore said X outrageous thing about homosexuals or religion. Do you agree? Or do you think he should be? I mean, we've seen this played out with President Trump himself. So it's a lot less effective when it's a Senate candidate or senator. But still, this is the last thing that moderate Republicans, reasonably moderate Republicans, people like Bob Corker wanted to see, I think. All right. I think we have time, Jay, for one more story, and this was something that came up just shortly after you and Trey did your show last week, and it's an issue we've talked about a lot on this show, and that's travel bans. Very early this week, President Trump issued a new permanent travel ban for citizens of Iran, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Chad, and North Korea, as well as for certain Iraqi and Venezuelan citizens. Now, this replaces the temporary ban that was scheduled for a Supreme Court hearing just a few weeks from now, in fact. Now, according to the administration, the new ban comes after a rigorous analysis of security measures in all foreign countries, really, with the countries on the banned list not meeting minimum security screening standards. And the administration has said that if these countries come into compliance, their ban will be reconsidered and potentially removed. And to me, while I have issues with the idea of this kind of broad travel ban, I think there's a lot of evidence suggesting that it, in fact, doesn't make us any safer. In fact, there was a great analysis from the Cato Institute, but among other places. But to me,
and the Cato Institute, we should mention, are not a bunch of far out liberals.
No, strong, about as strong libertarian group as you're going to find. And to me, while I disagree with this as a policy, I think that it's really hard to argue convincingly that this is unconstitutional. So I think this is a questionable policy in terms of the good it's going to do, the cost benefit. But I think this is absolutely something that passes constitutional muster. So what do you think, Jay?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the current ban probably will pass from the Supreme Court, assuming the Supreme Court even continues and hears arguments on the case. We had talked about this a while ago. Has at this point the whole ban been rendered moot? My sense is it probably has, and the Supreme Court asked for a briefing on that question, and that, I think, to me, that's good for a lot of reasons. And this isn't so much the policy reason, but rather just the idea that I prefer not to have the courts mucking about in national security issues and telling the president what he can or can't do on a national security issue like this. Again, the president, I would agree with you that the travel ban is probably superfluous at best and doesn't do a whole lot, but it may be a dumb idea, but it's within his authority. As Scalia once said that he wished he had he wished he had a stamp that said dumb but constitutional.
Yeah, definitely. I would stamp this that way. Now, you and I disagree a little bit as to the extent of, or to whether or not Trump's original travel ban was unconstitutional. You are willing to give a little more deference to the president on that, but we it seems like we definitely agree that this one potentially not the best policy idea, but hard to see this. I think reasonably being unconstitutional. So this should stand up, and this is how it's going to be, I think.
Yep.
All right.
I think so.
All right. Well, it's time for What We're Reading, where we step back from the often crazy pace of the news cycle. There sure was a lot going on this week, and talk about, more in-depth, thoughtful
We didn't
things.
even get to tax reform, which I promise we will, because that's a big issue for me. So.
Oh my gosh, we didn't get the tax reform.
Hang in there, people.
How did that even happen, Jay?
Well, we talked about doing it, but it was just a lot of other stuff going on.
Well,
and there will be more stuff.
We've got a little bit of time. How about if we swap out tax reform for what we're reading? I think what we're reading can hold. Yeah, I completely, folks. This is my fault. I got my story list messed up, and we almost got through the entire show without the big policy story of the week.
Biggest policy story of a generation.
Yeah,
perhaps.
Absolutely. Okay, here we go. So So let's talk about exactly what happened with the tax reform announcement. Essentially, there was a 9-page plan that was released this week, a joint effort of the Trump administration, the House Ways and Means Committee, and the Senate Finance Committee. Now, I broke it down. I took a good close look at it, and here are the key features of the framework as I understand them. Okay, Jay, you ready?
Okay, I'm ready.
Okay. Cutting the corporate tax rate from 39.1% to 20%, creating a new tax rate of 25% for pass-through businesses. And pass-through businesses, by the way, comprise 95% of all businesses in the U.S., and they're currently taxed at the generally much higher rate of their owners. Eliminating taxes on foreign earnings of U.S. companies, moving from 7 to 3 individual tax brackets, lowering the top individual bracket from 39.6% to 35%, eliminating almost all individual deductions, including the state and local tax deductions, but keeping the mortgage interest and charitable giving deductions, eliminating the alternative minimum tax, which targets the wealthiest Americans, as well as inheritance and gift taxes, and finally, doubling the individual standard deduction to $12,000 for individuals and $24,000 for married couples filing jointly. So that's, I think, my rundown of what I pulled out as the key points.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, I'd like to think so. Now, I should say that because we're dealing with a very vague framework at this point, it's really hard to say how big of a cut this would represent, though the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, they estimate that over a decade, this plan would cut taxes by $5.8 trillion and would increase the debt by $2.2 trillion. And yeah, that's a lot. Now, finally, I should point out that the Senate Republicans plan to use budget reconciliation to pass this measure if they can, meaning that they'll only need 50 votes, but also meaning that under the Byrd rule, the measure can't increase the deficit after 10 years, and that's pretty important. So Jay, I know you've been thinking a lot about this proposal or this framework. I'm sorry, this week. What are your thoughts on it?
I like it. I am pleased with where this is going, and with the understanding this is a framework. This is not going to be where things end up. There's two big pieces to it, and the first is I think the corporate tax reform, which is actually the more important piece. As you noted in your conversation with oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the economist now who you spoke to last week. He pointed out that this is something that most economists can agree on. That our corporate tax rate is too high and makes us less competitive globally. Some of the numbers I saw were that of the 35 most developed countries, we are number 35 in terms of our corporate tax rate. Now, people on the left often argue, well, that's corporate tax rate really was actually higher back in the Reagan era. And while that may be true, it's you play against it's relative. The problem is the rest of the world has lowered their corporate tax rates, and if we want to compete by keeping corporations here, that's something we need to do. And the other piece of this is that you didn't mention is it does provide a one-time tax on stockpiled foreign profits. Which allows for tax-free repatriation of future foreign profits, which is the encouragement for companies to keep money here, bring back money here. The inversions that have been talked about, where a company sets up its headquarters in Ireland and essentially avoids a lot of U.S. tax because all the money is going into Ireland. This allows us to get that money back, and I think that's important, and I think most economists would agree on that this is a good goal. And the problem is it sets up the easy sort of populist argument, if it's a tax cut for big corporations.
Well, and of course, it is a tax cut for big corporations, and that's now in terms of talking about first principles. well, yeah, exactly, and that's the Republican response, and the logic or the argument is that the tax cut will spur investment and growth and that sort of thing, right, Jay? Now, and the thing is, though, is the liberal response to that argument is, well, okay, maybe, and there's certainly something to be said for that. A lot of Republicans will say, well, we can cut taxes and the growth will pay for it. But, you mentioned something Glenn Hubbard said about the agreement that the corporate tax rate is too high. He also said that tax cuts don't pay for themselves. Now, this is a guy who engineered to this point the biggest tax cut, the Bush tax cuts, 1.5 trillion. He flat out said to me, tax cuts don't pay for themselves. He said you can get some growth that can minimize their overall, effect, make them, there is some stimulus, but that's one issue in which I think too many non-economist Republicans aren't being honest about. This is not going to pay for itself. That's just simply not going to happen. But another point I want to make is that, the problem I have with this argument that, well, we're going to see a lot of growth from this is right now, corporate earnings are at record levels, number one. And secondly, corporations are holding nearly $2 trillion in cash right now. And that you look at those numbers for corporate earnings, that's been going up like a reverse ski slope sort of thing for like about almost a decade now. The problem is not that corporations don't have the money to invest. They're not investing for other reasons. So I find a flaw in this argument that, well, if we can just get more money to these corporations, they're going to invest because they have a ton of money sitting around already that they're not using for this purpose. So I'm a little skeptical of this argument, given what we know about the corporate earnings and corporate profits that aren't being used right now.
Well, we'll wait and see. My sense is you're going to see an uptick in corporate investment. I think there's probably been some. I don't have any numbers in front of me right now, but I think already this year, I would sense that just if you look at the employment rate, there is a sense that more companies are hiring now. So no, look, I get it, but regardless, to me, it's not even so much that it's where is this money flowing to? Is it flowing into the U.S. or is it flowing out to other places with lower taxes? And because that's going to happen regardless of whether they just hold it as cash or invest it. I think still it's better to have it here. The other piece of this that I think is fascinating, and we could really talk a whole lot more about, and I know we're really running long on this show, but on the individual front, two big things have happened. One, if you're talking about cutting out the various stratifications and moving to a simplified tax code, I think that is good and healthy, and something that conservative economists have been arguing for years. And that what you essentially do is lower the marginal tax rate, meaning there are fewer of these speed bumps, so to speak, as your income increases. And the other piece is the getting rid of the state and local tax deduction. And I speak as someone who takes full advantage of the state and local tax deduction. But it's a fascinating sort of thought. I don't think that that's going to stay in there. But it does show the sense of, look, the people who benefit most from that are the more wealthy homeowners and people who live in higher priced houses in high tax districts. So it's a funny sort of. I think if you're going to argue that it's hard to argue that is soaking the poor, and in fact, in a lot of cases, it's sort of a wealth transfer to blue states. So
yeah, I was going to say it's soaking Democrat states as a general rule, right?
Well,
I don't think that's going to stay in either. One question I wanted to ask you, and we're going to talk a lot more about this as this goes from a framework to a real plan. But one thing I wanted to ask you is, whatever happened to deficit hawks? I remember a time when there were all kinds of Republicans who, if there was a plan that looked like it was going to increase a deficit, not by even a paltry few $100 million, not to mention billion, not to mention trillions of dollars, would totally freak out. Sort of my prototypical Republican of the '90s, Bob Dole, was one of these guys, right? But where are they now? They're trying to make this weird argument of, well, dynamic scoring and tax cuts will pay for themselves and so forth. They just don't have any, real empirical basis. I miss the old green eye shade Republicans. Well, what happened to those folks, Jay?
Well, I think there were still some out there. Again, I've always been a fan of the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which sort of proposed that sort of a one-for-one deficit hawk reduction. Even though I agree. I mean, I think there ought to be some dynamic part written. I mean, here's the thing. I look. You're right. The empirical data says tax cuts don't always pay for themselves. You would say never pay for themselves. I maybe disagree with you on that. But look, there's two sides to this. One is controlling spending. The other is fixing the tax code to increase growth. We need to increase growth no matter what, because we're not doing a good job of the controlling spending piece of it. So as you mentioned those numbers earlier, this would be a $5 trillion tax cut. It would increase the deficit by $2 trillion. Again, I think that's one of those. You're still better off being able to deal with a deficit if you've got some positive growth moving forward, and then you can talk about cutting spending. But ideally you can do both. But just because you can't do both, I think you still need to boost the economy because spending isn't slowing down, even under a Republican legislature and a Republican president.
And that's my point.
They've shown themselves unable to do that.
Yeah, and that's my point. It's the Republicans. You used to say about the Democrats, they're the party of tax and spend, but Republicans are the party of tax cut and spend. And I guarantee you, one of those things is less sustainable over the long term than the other. And so I think this is a real failure of nerve on the part of the Republican Party, certainly. And I think we're going to come to grief because of that sort of thing, because I guarantee you the things that tend to stay in are the spending related measures, and the tax cuts as well. And so Republicans have been kicking this can down the road for a long time, and $2 trillion, that's not peanuts. That's an awful lot of money. And already our federal debt is 103% of GDP, and that's been rising crazy fast since 2008. If we don't take care of that, we can't grow our way out of this. We have to find a way to, some kind of a plan that involves both growth and spending related issues. And I don't see that happening. And, the Democrats have a plan. You may not agree with it, but raising taxes dramatically will certainly address this, at least in theory. The Republicans don't even have a sound theoretical response to this. And I think that's...
No. I disagree that this isn't a sound theoretical.
But tax cuts don't pay for themselves. I mean, Glenn Hubbard said it. If right. Glenn, so that's what I'm saying.
But again, I mean, I think you're going with the assumption that the government always needs to keep increasing spending and keep spending on what it is spending on. I would say the more money you put into people's hands, private individuals, private corporations, ideally, the less government help is going to be needed down the road. So, I think that's more the theory. I mean, if people have more money in their pockets, they're not going to need more government assistance, and maybe then we can move towards cutting some of that spending. But to me, look, you've got to make, if you don't get growth going and you're not competitive on the world stage, you need to do that because, look, like I said, we're failing at cutting spending, but that's another story. At least we can start by getting this part right.
Well, I think that I point out we're in the middle of the longest economic expansion in a long time, 8-9 years, something like that at this point. So, and of course, if you listen to the president, he'd say that growth is absolutely fantastic. I'm a little more skeptical than you are about the ability of these changes in the tax code to spur the sort of growth that you and other Republicans see. And I'm a little more worried, I think, than you are about adding trillions of dollars onto the already massive federal debt, which is
it's good that you're becoming a budget hawk.
I always have
returning to your
been.
budget hawk
I was going to
roots.
say
So,
that the party didn't,
um,
I didn't leave the party on that issue. The party left me on that
okay.
issue. So anyway, I think that about does it for this action-packed, full to the brim episode of the show for this week at least. Thanks everyone for listening. We really do appreciate it. And we hope you like what you heard and that you'll check out today's sponsors. First is DaVinci. Book your space now at DaVinciMeeting.com/TPG. And the first hour is on them. ZipRecruiter. Politics Guys listeners can post on jobs on ZipRecruiter for free. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/PoliticsGuy. And SeatGeek. Politics Guys listeners get $20 off their first SeatGeek purchase. Just download the SeatGeek app or go to SeatGeek.com and enter promo code PoliticsGuy today. Listener support's big help to us. We do appreciate it. If you're interested in helping us out, go to politicsguys.com and click on the Patreon link. If you want to support the show without spending anything, it would be great if you could share this episode with your friends, followers, and pass along our new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter. Also, leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes really helps. If you got a question, comment, correction, or just want to say hi, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com or on our Facebook page where you can message us and where we post stuff throughout the week. That's facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.